The title of our discussion that we're about to have is The Race of Our Lives, which came from you when we spoke recently. That was your phrase, and it's exciting. We're in a race, but it's a little depressing. I mean, so there's, data points. We just had the hottest January, February, and March on record. Sea levels are rising faster than they have in a couple of millennia, supposedly. There's a lot of bad news, but explain in your framing why you think that humankind is at this juncture that's kind of an existential moment for us.
Well, we've been around for, let's say, 300,000 years. We've had agriculture for 12,000 years, and yet we've come down to 100 years where the whole ball game is playing out. If you gave me the technology of 1900 and today's population, we've had it. We don't have a prayer. Society as we know it will collapse. But if you reverse that and you give me today's technology and the population of 1900, which is 1.5 billion, we cruise to glory. No problem at all. Everything will work out fine. It's just that little 100-year window, the race between technology, population, and resources running out and pollution piling up. And it's going to be a very close horse race. Just let me say a little bit about the weather. I was presenting recently in a quarterly letter something I haven't seen before, and that is the first 50 years of the last century, the weather increased by 7 bips centigrade a year, 0.007. In the second 50 years...
Just explain what that means, 7 bips.
0.007 degrees centigrade.
Which doesn't sound like a lot, but...
In the second 50 years, it increased by 15 bips, just over twice as much, 0.015. And if you take the El Nino outlier of 98 and you line it up with February of this year, another El Nino, that is escalating at 25 bips, 0.025, 7, 15, 25. It's not just that the climate is warming, the climate is accelerating. My guess is we have no chance at 2 degrees, let alone 1.5, and that if we really try hard and run this race as best we can, it will get to 3 degrees centigrade. And at 3 degrees centigrade, North America has some inconveniences, and Africa is a basket case.
So that's a little concerning. Now, you're a believer in technology. I mean, for instance, you said to me last year that if we fast forwarded 30 years, it's an absolute certainty that there'd be plentiful, cheap energy, presumably cleaner energy. And that sounds pretty good. That sounds like, we can make that work, right? But so what's going to happen in the meantime that makes you worried that we might still be doomed? And what gives you the confidence that we are going to get there on the energy side?
It's funny. There is no group I belong to where I feel comfortable. And in this case, the race of our lives, I'm an environmentalist, and they're a very pessimistic lot. And I think they all underestimate, either by a little or by a lot, how fast technology is moving. It really is miraculous what is happening in solar, wind, the grid, potentially, and storage. Every brain, it seems, these days is working on storage. Conversely, you guys, this is obviously a tech California happy group, you have absolutely no idea of how rapidly population and resource squeeze and weather, climate is moving against us. And so both groups underestimate either the good news or the bad news. And I feel stuck in the middle with my own particular view with which nobody agrees.
So now I'm going to make you feel bad for a second, because I'm going to point out that in April 2011, you wrote a piece called "Time to Wake Up. The Age of Cheap and Plentiful Resources is Over Forever." And commodity prices were at a high, they were going higher, and you are, part of your reputation is the fact that you recognize bubbles and have pointed out, ahead of other people when we're in bubbles. And since then, the price of commodities has come tumbling down pretty much across the board. So I'm not just trying to make you feel embarrassed, but what are the ramifications of that? With lower prices of all these commodities, notably oil, is that going to set us back? Is that really bad news at this point, despite these gains in technology?
Let me quickly point out what a cheap trick this was, because a week ago I wrote a quarterly letter which confessed to this crime. And as you know, in the stock market, letter writers and pundits never ever make any mistakes. So this was itself quite a
Journalists
unusual.
never make mistakes either, by the way.
No, journalists
We never get
neither.
it wrong.
Well, I made a mistake, but not about oil. Oil is much more volatile than anybody realizes, even senior officers in oil companies. Around the normal trend, the typical range is more than a double, less than a half. So for 100 years up until OPEC, it traded at 16, but it would go to 35, it would drop to 6 or 7. And then after OPEC, it traded around 35, but it would go to 80 and it would drop to 16. And then it took another kick up more recently in the last 10 years to about $65 today. And around $65, which is the cost of finding a decent amount of new oil, it's entitled to move to 140 and to move to 30. And it just went to 150 and it went to 28. But this is much more normal than you might imagine. It didn't go to 28 because fracking had discovered some ultimately cheap resource. Fracking is not a cheap oil. Fracking is incredibly capital intensive. It's not even clear they were drowning in black ink at $100. There was no massive positive cash flow in the fracking industry. And obviously they're closing down their rigs now week by week. And the price has just bounced 70% from 28 to 48. And the rigs are still coming down. No, this was because fracking in general is a cowboy industry where they have absolutely no regard for demand. So they're just producing as fast as they can. And for a temporary window of a year and a half, they got ahead of demand. And when that happens in a commodity like oil, the price goes down to marginal cost, which is negligible, and so the price collapses. Just as when there's a shortage, it will go up multiples. The excesses are running out. I would almost guarantee you in the next 2 or 3 years it will pass well through 65. My personal bet is it will hit 100 again. So oil is not an exception to the general principle. Oil has been rising fairly steadily for a long time. It's an exception to the commodity history. Commodities in general had declined until 2000 pretty steadily, 70% on average, but oil had not. Oil had been flat. And since 2000, oil has tripled to today's trend.
So I know through the Grantham Foundation, you're investing in technology to try to bring down the long-term price of oil by making oil less relevant, at least in transportation. Could you maybe talk about some of the technology you're investing in that you're excited about personally?
Yes, I can. And in general, energy will not be the problem for humanity going forward. Technology will get this one. The main problem will be food and population, which you're obviously not interested in. But
I think everybody here eats.
But yes, our foundation allows itself 20% of mission-driven investing. And given our predisposition, you can imagine where they go. We're investing in a California-based attempt to double the power-to-weight ratio of lithium-ion batteries, for which we have great expectations. But back in Boston, we have come across the concept fairly well developed of a very lightweight, ultra-streamlined vehicle weighing only a few hundred pounds, not the 4,000 pounds of Tesla, but less than 400 pounds. And if you have that sort of lightweight machine, carbon fiber, basically, you can do amazing things, even with today's battery. You can drive it as fast as any machine on the road. You can drive it for 1,000 miles between charges, not because the battery is sensational, but because you're moving 1/10 of a Tesla, and with even better streamlining than a Tesla has. And it's perfect for a first car, perfect for commuting or shopping. And cars like that on the road change everything. It uses less energy than you do walking to work. And that is about as far as any technology can push you. And all of that will happen in the not too distant future, and it will be combined with self-driving programs, and it will be a different world in terms of transportation.
When you say the not too distant future, how far out do you, when you're investing, how far out do you imagine this time frame being?
I think in 10 years, everybody, the man on the street, the woman on the street, will see that the game is over for the gasoline engine. Whether they'll see that in 5 years, I don't know. My guess is the price of oil rises a lot in the intermediate time period because the low prices turned off capital spending. And then following 5 years, between 5 and 10, I don't know. And after 10, I'm pretty certain that it's almost game over. A paradigm shift for oil as we phase out our use.
So I want to remind people, if you have questions, you can go ahead and start raising your hands, and we have microphones in the room. We have a question right up front. Let's wait for a microphone. Here comes one now. And remember to identify yourself right in front. Alan Murray will identify himself.
I don't have to identify myself.
No,
you just did. Thank you. Alan Murray with Fortune. I'm curious why you are so optimistic about technology when it comes to energy, but not optimistic about technology when it comes to food.
The biggest failure of capitalism that I could think of, I described a little parable of a contract between the devil and the farmer. And the devil arrives in the Midwest, and let's say, to simplify in the interest of time, he offers the farmer and his family for the next 100 years a deal in which he will triple their farm profits. And there's always, with the devil, 21 clauses, and clause number 3 is that it will cost them 1% a year of their soil. That happens to be almost a consensus of the rate at which today the planet is losing its soil, basically because of big ag. So of course he signs the contract, and the family and his grandson and his great-great-great-grandson makes a killing, and everybody is happy, and the final one, at least when the starving crowds arrive from Chicago, dies rich. But there is no MBA ever coined who will not sign that contract with the devil. The discounted future value, who cares about 100 years? We are running through 1% a year our soil, and there is nothing that capitalism can do about it. They are not even interested in the topic because it is too distant and remote, the tyranny of the discount rate. Anything that happens in 30 years is irrelevant. But really, soil is like air and water. It really is a common good. It's all we have. It is utterly vital, and we are losing it. And big ag is plowing through this stuff together with fertilizer. You can't grow anything without phosphorus and potassium. And we mine those things. We mine them and we scatter them around the Midwest in far greater quantities than is necessary to save a little time and make a little more money. And mines are finite. And if you ask a professor of agriculture, he will say, oh, it's just a question of price. To which I say, oh, you mean it'll be okay at a price where half the world starves? Now, that is the big problem we should be thinking about, far worse than energy. And it's the worst intersection of climate change, which causes droughts and floods. Let me point out that it is only very heavy floods, heavy downpours that cause erosion. An ordinary rainfall, even a heavy rainfall, does not erode much soil. The farmers are not completely stupid. It is the heavy 5 or 10 rains a year that cause all the erosion, and half of that in 2 or 3 really bad ones. It is exactly those heavy downpours that are increasing by 2, 3, 4, or 5 times by 2100. What happened in Houston the week before last is a classic example. 3 inches of rain an hour, hour after hour. Within 24 hours, they had had 4 months of rain. Now that will erode anyone's soil, however careful they are. It is that multiplying the factor of erosion means that 1% a year is now off the table. It's accelerating.
You just eroded my confidence that we're going to win the race a little bit, but so I can see how technology gives us electric cars that are amazing, and we can sort of phase out gasoline, but how do you apply technology to these kinds of problems, the fundamental destruction of our soil? Do you see a path forward for technology to help us there?
Yes, we have, as humans, everything within our grasp to rise above all of these problems. The difference is what we're capable of on paper and what we actually are capable of in real life, given our predispositions to be short-term and like to lead a nice fat cat life. And it's at that difference that this is all being played out. If you don't want to erode, you don't till. No-till has taken over in Argentina and Brazil. It's only 30% in the US, and around the world, it's 10%. But there are relatively quick fixes to these problems, but only if you decide to do it. If you wait for decades, you get into a problem. Sustainable agriculture in the developed world will take down output by 25%. Do it now while we have a surplus. We waste a lot of food. We can easily absorb 25%, but we won't do that. What we will do is we will wait until there is no safety margin, until we are really worried about sustainability, and then it becomes politically extremely difficult to cut back 25% to introduce truly sustainable agriculture. But it can be done, and it could be done today. And we have plenty of time today. We will not have plenty of time in 40 years.
And we are running out of time now, but I just want to ask you really quickly, are we going to win this or not? If you had to place your bet now.
Damn it, it's a 50-50 as far as I'm concerned.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Jeremy